be able to wrap up our chronology.
Did you hand out something else last week? I was watching and it looked like you were
I
passing.
gave out a chronology of Calvin that would fit well with it.
Borrow one of those because I set mine at home.
Sure, and I realized, I'm going to have to borrow one too. I realized that even though I had the book there, I thought it was right on top.
This is a chronology, not of Calvin, but of the.
That is Luther, that's the one we use. We're going to take that too. And I'm going to have to take it too because somehow I managed to not grab my chronology book. That should be okay. It just means I'll be hamstrung the same way as you, not knowing what the colors are, but I think we can, if I pay attention to the words, we'll be okay. So, for those of you at home, we're on the last couple of pages of the chronology, I believe. The timeline. It's, let's see. We got right to the top of it, so I'm going to start at the bottom of the third one with 1562 and the Wars of Religion in France. And I'm actually going to back up a little bit before that because I wanted to point out something I didn't think to bring with me before. We talked about the Wycliffe's New Testament in the time frame, 1388. Talked about Tyndale's New Testament, 1526. There are other things I don't have before. We in 1599 we mentioned the Geneva Bible, but we made some reference a couple of times to the Book of Prayer, which has its pluses and its minuses. And I have a copy of the 1559 prayer book, which would be before the Geneva Bible, before the King James. It is mostly good, but I mean, again, there were some problems because, as we mentioned in 1662, which we haven't gotten to in our timeline yet, there was the Great Ejection, and that was ministers, nonconformists and Puritans and others and separatists who did not want to have to teach exclusively by the Book of Common Prayer, be bound by the Episcopal ordination of the Church of England. And some of them, it wasn't that they objected wholly to the Book of Prayer, but they objected to being held to it. And there were parts that they did object to. But here's a copy. If you'd like to take a look through it, I'll pass it around to you. So this would be the one that Queen Elizabeth would have had in hers. I'll hand it to you to pass around. And so it's my personal copy, and but it's a nice piece of history.
So it's not the 1559.
It's not literally 1559.
I was wondering, should we be touching it without gloves?
It would be probably in a protected place, and I was able to pick this up at
UV, University of Virginia Press.
Yeah, I picked it up in D.C. at when they had the big display for I think the 400th anniversary for the King James. They had a big display with a bunch of the old Bibles, ones you couldn't see, and they had a copy of that. I didn't want to pass up that opportunity.
Some red text in here, I noticed.
Yeah, it's set up
Ceremonial.
Yeah, it's set up ceremonial, and I have actually used it as a guide with funerals and different things. So I have actually used parts of it, and you've actually had incorporated at times in parts of the service, maybe unbeknownst to you.
Font and regular.
And so, yeah, and so it is useful in some ways. I like those who got in trouble in 1662 would not want to have to be bound to it to use it in an authoritative way. It's not the Bible, but I think it can be helpful.
A tool.
Right, a tool if used rightly. So 1562, Wars of Religion in France. 1563, the Heidelberg Catechism. I made a statement about that, and I told you that I thought the Orthodox, I couldn't remember clearly. Okay, what we went through last year, the Orthodox Catechism we went through, that is the Baptist version of the Heidelberg. And so the Heidelberg itself came out in 1563. Now, this will be later, I believe.
About 1770 or 78, 87.
Probably something like that. Let me see if we had an actual date on it.
I thought I'd read it somewhere there.
Probably did. Let's see. I was hoping it would be obvious, so I could just open up and say, "Oh, there it is."
Forward, wouldn't it? Or would it be frontispice?
Collins. Well, Collins lived. The Heidelberg Catechism, 1563. Collins lived from 1646 to 1702. So he did his. 1608 is when he did his Baptistic version of it. So you have the Heidelberg Catechism, 1563, and a little more than 100 years later, he did a Baptist version of it, which is a very good. And one of the the things they liked about it is the Heidelberg is often known as the Catechism of Comfort, because it focuses on where, I mean, how did it begin? It began with the words of, what is your only comfort in life and death? And so he saw the value of Baptists being able to have that in a way they could honestly interact with, dealing with things we would be at
They
variance
probably
with.
used the comfort like it was really made, and that's with strength.
Yeah.
Comfort.
And so, and where it's really
We
from,
use it
where do
for
we,
touching
well, where do
people.
we find our, right, well, that's what he's taking us, where do we find it? We find it in the Lord. We don't find it in all the things the world likes to find it in. So, but that's, so now turning to those last two pages, we have also in 1563 the 39 articles issued by the Church of England. And so this was 39 articles of belief that were issued. These would have been after the Book of Prayer, and with some they ran afoul of them. Now, I do not have a copy. It might have been good to have a copy, but we may touch on them throughout the year just to kind of be aware of them. But so we see that then Fox's Acts and Monuments, what we call his Book of Martyrs, is published that same year. So those who are familiar with that, that's when that book was published. Now that's an interesting resource. It has some good stuff in it, but it also has some questionable. He compiled lists of martyrs that sometimes we're not certain about, but yet it's a very helpful guide to see where the church has trod in areas of persecution. Now here, just to give us time frame, 1564 to 1616, you have William Shakespeare. So we see him being born just after these things. He's born the year after the Acts and Monuments and after the 39 article. And this kind of gives us a time frame for him and some of the things he wrote, realizing much of what his plays were often, they had a point. And they were often pointed at certain politicians. That we miss that today when we read them. But he was creatively criticizing sometimes, or maybe it wasn't necessarily criticism, but mocking. It's hard to tell sometimes. So some of his stuff is interesting for that fact. Now also we have 1566, Mary Stuart. That's the Queen of Scots. She flees to England. Now this is the one who was in Scotland, leading Scotland, and she's an important one to note because who is her son? King James is her son. So she, but now he's raised apart from
He
her.
would have been the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England.
Exactly. And now he's raised Protestant. She's Catholic, but he was raised apart from her. But and so she was there and never liked Knox. She was nervous about Knox, even though he was a weakened man because of the things that happened to him, like being a slave on a galley ship, rowing and stuff like that, which broke his health. He was strong of the Lord. Now, also we know that he published his little work that got him in the doghouse even with Elizabeth, which really wasn't intended toward her, but it was more intended toward Bloody Mary, not even this Mary, really. But so she has fled at this point where she's had to flee Scotland for safety under Queen Elizabeth, and who ultimately puts her to death. Then we have what they call the Vestularian controversy of the Church of England, which I'm not absolutely, based on the name, I'm going to assume it has something to do with the vestments, but I don't really know right off, so I can't speak authoritatively to that. But they had a series of conflicts and difficulties, and this may not being certain, and not being certain of the word, it's probable something like that, because first of all, you have England resisting reform, then you have at Henry's convenience them doing reform for the wrong reason, but many men within the church saw an opportunity and they seized it. But so you had a mixed bag there, pulling this way and pulling that way, and so that led for them to have some conflicts and difficulties that you didn't see in some of the other Reformed areas, as the Reformation areas. So also right behind that, 1568 to 16, that's a long time. The Dutch Wars of Religion, or the 80 Years' War. Anybody here over 80?
Right.
Yeah. So, but you're over 80, Dan?
Yeah.
Okay. So how old are you? Just for reference, how old are you?
84.
So 84. So if you were living, you would have either been your life could have overlapped this. But I mean, what, you'd been 4 when it started, or or you'd have been 1. So this would have been taking your entire life almost. If you were born that year and you lived to be 84, you'd have been your whole life would have been consumed by this. Most people in that time didn't live that long. So if they were born the year of that, they would never see the end of it. If they were born in the middle of it, they might be older when they saw it. If they were, so for some, in 1570, we have Pius V, papal bull.
Good word for it.
Yeah, I know. And always when I think of papal bull, I always think of the one against Luther that he burned. That's always where my head goes right away. But there were many others. And he declares Elizabeth a heretic. Now, of course, think about this. In his mind, she was born of an illegitimate marriage and then replaced what he would want to call a legitimate, her sister, because she was Catholic. And so then we have 1570, the consensus, where you have that reconciles the Polish Protestants. I can't speak to that one again. That's another one. There's just so much to know, but it's an event. Just take note of it as we pass by it. There's also 1571, the battle. The Catholic coalition beats the Ottoman Navy. Then we have, now here's where it starts to get ugly, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Now, I want us to back up for a minute because see where we are? This is happening in France. If we go back to Calvin's chronology, now he's dead already. Calvin came from France and had to flee due to persecution there. But there was a huge move, what they call the Huguenots, within France, and there were great strides towards Reformation happening around France, although it was still in Catholic control. And he did not live to see this day, but he supported many of the Huguenots that went out. He supported a group of them that went to Brazil to take the gospel to Brazil and set up a colony that the Jesuits agitated for slaughter, and they were wiped out. When I was growing up as a kid in South Carolina, outside Hardyville was a little town that hadn't located, a settlement called Purrisburg, that they hadn't located at the time I was growing up, but they've since located it. And we knew it was a Swiss settlement of some kind. That's all we knew. Well, it turns out now, in retrospect, it was a Huguenot settlement coming out of some of these kind of things that had settled there, and it just didn't make it. And many of them went to Charleston, and some went to Savannah. And they had a bunch of them die. So just interesting, these time frames, these ones that moved around to see the overlap in time period.
Northern Florida?
No, that was in South Carolina, the Savannah River. But on the South Carolina side, just a little bit west up the river from Savannah, and so they were looking for it when I was a kid, and have located it now. I've not had a chance to go out there, but and see it myself. Whatever they've done with it, if they've done anything. But so we see here what happens here with St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. There was a wedding, and there were involvement with the Protestants and the Catholics, and there was supposedly okay. They used that opportunity, the Catholics did, the Medicis, to murder much of the top leadership of the Protestants in France, those that were affecting change. And they pulled people in the streets, pulled them out out of their beds, threw them from windows. It was a horrible slaughter. Now, when we look at the state of France over the generations, we see one thing happening in England. They've had their trouble, but you see actually Reformation there, and then you see France. And what happened? They killed some of their best and wiped it out, and you see them right there beginning to lay the groundwork for the French Revolution, even as they ultimately then reject Christianity and then embrace other things. And we see how it's affected them through the future. So that's a major thing to note and remember and lament. Then we have in 1575 the agreement between the Czech Protestants. In 1570, the Spanish Fury sack of Antwerp. Again, I can't speak of that one totally, but it's just take note of it on your radar. And then in 1579, the first Archbishop, does that say Manila? Manila appointed. Well, realize there has been, earlier on in our timeline, we saw...
Now, is that necessarily where you're thinking it is?
Yeah, because remember earlier on we had the guy who came and brought Catholicism, I think actually, to the Philippines. And so, and actually, we know that that was one of the things that affected there. The Philippines were largely controlled by the Catholics up until a certain point. Then when they were divided up between the Methodists and everybody else, I think after the war.
Well, around with that Easter time or Passover time,
Yeah.
I think of flogging themselves.
Yeah, that's all coming out of that. And some of them crucifying themselves. But that's certain areas. If you go to the Philippines now, you see they're divided up in areas that would have been traditionally. And so, if y'all remember Darwin and the Filipino church that was here with us, the area they were from, Baguio and stuff, was originally given over to the Methodists. So when he grew up, they were Methodists, but then he got saved and they became Baptists. And so we see that. So we can see, thinking about the world, not just Europe, seeing the gospel, even if in some crippled form, moving across the world. And in 1580, we see the essays are published. The Montaigne. Oh, did I miss something?
The Formula of Concord.
Yeah, the Formula of Concord. Most German Lutherans. Yeah, that's more important for us to notice in Reformation history. Thanks for catching that. And then 1581, the Jesuit Edmund here is executed in London. So the Catholics aren't the only one killing those opposed to them. In 1582, the Gregorian calendar is adopted. Now think about that. So because the calendar is right, the calendar changes a couple of times here and there. So that's 1582, and but not everybody changes at the same time over to it, because if you look at these adoptions, there's an official date, but you see it being adopted in other places over time. And so then 1583, the Jesuit, one of the Jesuits enters China. 1583 to 1605, we see that there's the Jesuit reductions established in South America, and I'm not certain what that is, but I would not be surprised if there if that didn't have something to do with some of the other problems. I think that's I can't speak to it authoritatively, but I don't think that's a good thing. So then 1584, William of Orange is assassinated in the Netherlands. So now that's sad. He was a strong Protestant leader, and he was assassinated by a supposed friend, if I remember. Is that correct, Calvert? Do you remember? Yes. Yeah. An advisor whom he trusted. Isn't that nice?
Years working his way into his trust for that purpose.
Yeah. So think about that. He came there with a purpose to kill him, spent years gaining his trust just so he could. That's just sad. Then we have the colloquy of the Montbéliard fails to unite Lutherans and the Reformed. So they made several attempts to kind of get on the same page between those in Switzerland and those in Germany and the different parts, and just could not always get together there. Then we see 1586, we see there's the Slovene reformer, Trubar dies. 1588, we have this tract published in England. Then we have 1588, the Spanish Armada fails to invade England. Now that's a historical point you could note, in those who remember history. Kind of gives you a marker with what's going on in Spain and England. And we have, of course, Elizabeth on the throne here, and there was a real concern. Then 1590, the first complete Hungarian Bible translated. So that's nice. So now the Hungarians have the Bible in their language. 1593, Henry IV of France renounces Protestantism, and then another sad turn in history. But 1598, the Edict of Nantes grants French Huguenots limited toleration. Yeah, we're going to quit killing them. And so, but that's an important one. And then as we look here, we see that it's a continuation, because we've already noted, Shakespeare earlier, that this will bring some of these together. So we'll see the carryover, Shakespeare's continued life, and you can see how long he lived in reference to some of these other things during that same time period. Okay, let's pick up where we have left off. Let me find that. 1598. Work my way down here to the place. Okay, along with that, actually, let's see, 1598, we're moving here. Here's your next one, 1603 to 1625, James I of England. That's James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, and the nephew of Queen Elizabeth. And he becomes, she dies leaving no heir to the throne, and he is already established as the King of Scotland there, and then comes in. This was probably a good thing.
Forecast of the UK.
Yeah. In 1604, this would be after in his first year reigning, anti-Trinitarian Italian, I can't see his name clearly.
Fausto Sozzini.
Thank you. He died. And
he made good spaghetti.
Yeah. 1605, Italian Jesuit missionary Robert de Nobili arrives in India. So you see the Jesuits are busy. They're in China, they're in Japan, the Philippines. They're all over the place. In Brazil. And they're a very young order, but they're on the move. 1605, the gunpowder plot is foiled. Okay, that is where. Help me with this one, Coward. They were gonna blow up the Parliament. They had packed explosives underneath it, and I can't remember what happened. It didn't work out. Something failed.
They dug from the basement of a house, like across the street from the Parliament building, and dug under the Parliament building, and someone came into the basement and found them
Before they could do it.
about a day ahead.
So.
Otherwise, they would have blown up the entire Parliament in grand fashion.
Yeah.
Might not have been a terrible thing.
Guy Fawkes Day.
Yeah.
When you hear about Guy Fawkes Day, that's what that's about. So, that's an English.
The judge.
And actually, Guy Fawkes Day is it's on my calendar, but I don't remember how far away we are from it. But they put it in this calendar. They mark it. And so.
The judge who presided over the trial of the assassin had wore a metal rimmed hat, amid other things, to protect himself from being shot, because it was not a very popular trial.
Yeah. Now here, 1608. So this is to 74. John Milton. So we see him born during the reign of King James, and living to beyond that, of course.
That's the Paradise Lost author?
That's it, the Puritan. That's him. And so then in 1609, we have the Dutch Reformed theologian Jacob Arminius dies. So 1611, King James Version of the Bible is published. Now they've pulled in from several, and I have here. We need to pass this around. I'll pass this around. I have several editions of this. This one is made to look pretty much like it would look, although it would have been much bigger. But font and everything in this one. I have a couple of different versions that are. So now you guys are going to look at it here, Dan. Here's that book of prayer.
The Bible Museum put this out, right?
Yes, actually, I bought that at Walmart.
Okay, I just got a solicitation from them to donate it and become a brick at the wall or something.
Yeah.
I can't remember what they call it.
So my first edition I had, the one I tried to use one here for my Bible read through, is not in the font, but in the language and the lettering, the spelling, and it was a hard one to read through. And I can't remember. I picked it up at I think Barnes & Noble years ago. But this one, another guy told me that he found it at Walmart. I went looking and found it. I was excited to get a copy of that because I have a shelf where I keep these. It's just nice to have for references and to kind of give you an idea and to see a piece of history, even if it's just a reproduction. And so we have that 1611, but also that same year the English and the Scottish Protestants colonized Ulster.
So they didn't put the historical apocrypha in the middle of this.
No, they didn't actually, but it would have been in there.
Right, it's just as separate from the Bible, but just as a historical reference.
Right. And I believe my other copy that I have has the Apocrypha in it. And so, as we look at this, so then we have 1618 to 19. The Synod of Dort rejects Arminianism, and so that's an important historical event in the Reformed Church where often what you hear are the 5 points of Calvinism. What those came from is somebody didn't formulate those originally. What you had was you had a group called the Remonstrants. They objected to 5 points that the Reformed Church held to, and they put them forward. They met in the Synod of Dort to examine and make decisions about how to respond to that, whether to agree with it or disagree with it, and they rejected those, and that's where the 5 points come from. Although, Austin, today we hear it as tulip, but if you did it in the original order, it would have been utlip. And so somebody saw the value in moving the T around to get the word tulip to make it more memorable, but originally, in the original Synod, when they respond to it, they responded in that order. You would spell it utlip. And so, but that's not as
I read a
memorable.
list of things Jacob Arminius believed, and it sounded like he was 4 points of Calvinism.
Well, he pretty much. Actually, here's what to realize. We have to realize, first of all, this is his disciples, for the most part. He would have been considered largely a Calvinist, but he had some points of difference and a couple of important points. And then they developed some of these, and even then they didn't. This was maybe a dividing line where some of them went more in the direction that we would know them today than they were originally. And but this was. So a lot of times when people think of the 5 points of Calvinism, they think some guy sat down and formulated something and then they argue about it. Really what happened is, like most of church history, somebody came out with something, the church responded to it, and then we have a creed, or we have some kind of confession made. So that's really where those points came from. They came out as a response to 5 remonstrations against what was held to believe and believed to be true by the church at the time in the Reformed Church in the Netherlands. So we see that. That's an important point in history. Then we have the 30 Years' War in Germany, overlapping and beyond that period. We have in 1620, which falls within that time period, the English Pilgrims arrive in Massachusetts on the Mayflower. So this kind of gives you a picture of what's going on, who's doing what, and then we have 16, and this isn't giving all the players which kings are in leadership. We don't have who's ruling in England and who's ruling in each of the countries listed here, but you could lay them out and see, well, who's king now, and different. So we have 1621, the Counter-Reformation leader Cardinal Robert Bellamy dies. 1623 to 62, Pascal. So we have Pascal during this time period. French religious
He's
thinker.
also a mathematician.
Yeah, mathematician, a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to think about. And so then we have 1625 to 49. We also have Charles I reigns in England and Scotland. So we have him there coming after James. So actually we do have a mark as to who's where. We have James and then we have him. So who was ruling at the time that the Mayflower came? Well, it would have been James. See? To give you a picture of who's on the throne, who are the movers and shakers at the time. And actually King James is not the one that's problematic. It's Charles and Charles II that are the real problems often for the Puritans and stuff. So then we have 1631, Gustavus Adolphus wins the battle of Bretteville, saving the Protestant cause. 1633, Galileo here, before the Inquisition. So this gives you a picture. Who's on the throne in England? Who's in Spain? What's going on with the Inquisition? You have Galileo here living during Charles' reign, although he would have been born earlier than that. And his difficulty arises, of course, on the continental Europe. 1637, René Descartes publishes his discourse on method. So Pascal, Descartes, these guys are all living in this time frame we're looking at. And while the Reformation is growing and they're having their disputes between the Puritans and Charles is going to be taken off the throne and beheaded during the time of Cromwell. All of this is happening when these men are alive and writing and doing their works. As Shakespeare is alive during this period. If you look, see, he's alive to 1616, right? So I guess no, he's not alive at this point now. I'm looking at the wrong timeline, but looking at the right numbers. But we see him, seeing some of these things on their rise. Then we have the French Catholic Cornelius Jansen, his publication. We have 1641, the Irish Revolt breaks out. 1642 to 49, the English Civil War. So this is what's going to end up with Charles losing his head. All of this is going on during this time period. Westminster Assembly begins meeting in 1643. So we talk about the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is going to come out of these meetings, and from that we have the Second London Confession, which is basically the baptized version of it. The Charleston, with Philadelphia then, which in America we added 2 articles to it. Then we have the Charleston Confession, which took one of those articles away, and so those are all in early American Baptist life, that imprint. And so to see, well, here's where it begins in the time frame. 1643, the Scots adopt the Solemn League and Covenant. 1646, John Eliot begins his mission to the Native Americans. So that's over here. So missions to the Native Americans. Now, he's not the only one, but he's one of those. And 1648, the Westminster Confession. That's its publication date. So also that same year, the Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War. So all these things we've been reading about the 30 Years' War was going on during this time period. Then we have 1649, Charles I is executed. Now, what's interesting, when we see that, the Puritans who won the battle, some of them were very much against executing the king, and some were not. And later, when Charles II was put on, some of them were against him being put on the throne, and actually some of the ones who supported that eventually suffered at his hand, those who helped put him back on the throne. And some interesting things to learn from that. Cromwell and the Commonwealth did some things right, but the Puritans overstepped sometimes. And what they did, actually, it's kind of like when we look at Russia. Russia with their freedom and capitalism coming in, and then being uncertain about it and it being untested. Many of them want to return to what they knew before because it's what they're comfortable with. We see the same thing in England. The Puritans sometimes are heavy-handed and they overstep their bounds sometimes, and people wanted them to return to something that maybe really wasn't ideal, but because it seemed in the heat of difficulty better than what they now had. And so even amidst their own ranks. So, but we have Charles I executed here. 1656, Pascal's provincial letters ridicules Jesuits and defends the Jansenists. Okay, now that's interesting because the Jansenists are a problem in themselves, and they would be considered a heretical group, even by our standard, not just the Catholics. 1658, Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, dies. Okay. And then in 1660, 2 years later, the restoration of Charles II, who rules from 1660 to 85.
Was he related to Charles I?
He's his son.
Okay.
So, then we have during that time, to think about this, 2 years later, we've talked about this before, we had the Great Ejection of dissenting clergy in England. So Charles comes on, and actually some of the guys who supported bringing him in were some of the ones that got ejected. And then at the top of the page, well, it happens, From my own standpoint, I think they were foolish and wrong to restore the crown. I think they needed to reform the Commonwealth in some ways. They made some mistakes. I think they need to learn from them, but not return to their vomit, which is what they did in a sense. And in 1667, look at the top of this page, Milton publishes his Paradise Lost. So this is happening after the Great Ejection and some of these other things. 1675, Philip Jacob Spencer's Pia Desideria, I can't see it clear, Desideria, published. 1678, 3 years later, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is published. And where did he write that? In prison. Why was he in prison? He was a nonconformist and a Baptist. And he was in prison for preaching without due license, basically, because he wasn't allowed. And here's what happened. So if you look at the nonconformists and the separatists, they just want to worship away. You have the Puritans who got their name from wanting to purify the Church of England. So they wanted to stay in and fix it. Then you had the separatists and the nonconformists who said,
"Get out!
You just can't fix stupid." And they said, "Let's stay out." But these guys, what happened is, if you weren't in church and tithing to your local parish, you could be fined. They might send someone around to say, well, how come this guy's never showing up? And find out, oh, you're meeting in a bar and listen to some unauthorized guy preaching that the government has not authorized.
Like Obama Church.
And so actually, when you look at the way our nation is founded, and that's why we're looking at all this, we're going to talk about that beginning next week, why Luther matters and why that stuff matters. And we're going to see a lot of that bears even on our nation, even that lost people, the freedoms they enjoy here. When we look at things like the idea of the church and the state being separate, the idea that the church can't tax us to pay for a state church or tell us where we can worship. A lot of these are coming out of these times, is where they're coming out of. And times where our forefathers saw the value of not being dictated how to do worship by the government. That our president should not also be the head of the church, and things like that. And yet we've seen much on the progressives' end where they have, while they claim to hate religion, they've wanted to pretty much make a state religion. They're statists, and we should not actually call them liberals, because that name was stolen. The idea of liberal, what do? We give the gospel liberally. What do we do in a liberal arts education? You're educated broadly and liberally. So really, liberal should be a positive thing, but it was stolen, and we were strapped with conservative, which makes it sound like we're trying to conserve something old or traditionalist, when it really, Christianity fosters true classical liberalism. And what we should call these people are progressives.
Or leftists.
Or regressives, maybe. Maybe not progressives, regressives. And because, so we see that, and then here, 1682, right under Bunyan's, Pennsylvania founded on the basis of religious toleration. So when we look at the different, Virginia had a charter that had the Church of England in it. Now granted, the Pilgrims were coming, trying to land there, but they landed in Massachusetts. Massachusetts didn't do much better for freedom. But Rhode Island, which was founded by a Baptist, at least at the time he was still a Baptist.
The oldest church still up there?
Yeah, but it's not in good hands. And then also Pennsylvania. Both of them were founded on the idea of religious toleration, whereas many of the other colonies were not. They had established religions. So those are, in their founding, some of the freest places. Can't say they've stayed that way, but and so then you have in 1685 we have the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So Louis the 14th, he's a great guy, isn't he? He's setting the stage for the French Revolution, is what he's doing with his policies and his life and his living, and then we have 1688, the Glorious Revolution of William of Orange here. And here's what happened: things weren't going well for Charles. Things weren't happy there. Was James his brother or his uncle? I think James was his uncle, the brother to Charles I, but I can't remember if I've got the pedigree right. But anyway, he comes in real unpopular, and those in England invite William of Orange to come over, and he and Mary come over and depose James, and then also then carry over and take control in Ireland. Different ones will view that part differently, but they were pretty good leaders, and they ruled together for a time. This is the beginning of that. He's invited to England, and then 1689, the Toleration Act grants freedom of worship to dissenters in England. And notice this is coming with William and Mary coming. And so that is the end of our basic timeline. It doesn't really end there. There's more that happens after, but it brings us up to a certain point. And we may touch on some other dates and stuff throughout the year, but thought we could bring that together just to kind of get a picture over these 3 weeks of how these tie in together. You can take this timeline and look at it with the timelines or the chronologies of both Luther and Calvin and see some overlap, what was happening in the same years. And it's just interesting. So you can pick an event and see, what was happening in Luther's life then, what was happening in Calvin's life, how do their lives overlap, and what was happening in the world. If you may not have access at home. I have timelines, tons of them at home. I like things like that, but you can go on the internet and just do historical timeline and pick one of these things and just see what was happening in different places around the world. And it's very interesting to see what's happening in Europe, what's happening in America, what are the influences, who were the major thinkers, and who were the leaders at the time. And it gives us a better picture sometimes of what's really going on. And it's helpful for us to understand both church history and our own history as Americans and see where the interaction is. And so, any thoughts or questions? Sure.
Were all of these wars religion related, or some of them also like territory related?
Those are always a mixed bag. They're probably, with many of these during this time, are religious related in some way, but sometimes there's more at work here. It's kind of like, you could call some of the things Henry did religious, but yet what was really behind it. And so sometimes what you have is a convenient relationship to the church, like someone might submit to the Pope because it's wise to do so because then they're going to get the political clout they need. So there's a lot of crossover between, even as we look at things in our own history, there might be a religious face on it, but a lot of it might be business, it might be politics, and this is how it shapes out. When we look at what happened in Serbia and Bosnia a few years back, and often it's portrayed as a battle between Muslims and Christians, but if you get in there and really look at what the two factions believe, what you really had was a group of, for the most part, Christians in name only, and actually Muslims in name only. If you looked at what they were practicing and believed, neither one of them were true representations of either one of those religions. They were killing each other religiously, but they weren't really, it really came down to family politics, territorial war, and stuff like that. So a lot of times things have a face. Were a lot of these? Yes. The 30 Years' War, was it religious war? Yes. Was there politics involved? Certainly. Even in our own nation, we can look at different conflicts and see that there's sometimes two sides of this that are going on at the same time, two different things working. And you can say, was this mostly religious, or was it really wearing a face? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. So even with the stuff, much of the stuff that Catholics did, often there was a mix. Sometimes it was dressed up as religion. It wasn't anything more than just simply power politics. That answer your question adequately? So, okay. Any other questions? With that, why don't we close in prayer? Father, we thank you so much that you have gifted us with the ability to educate ourselves about what has happened, to look back. And we pray, Father, that as we examine the things that have happened, that you will help us in our separateness from the events, be able to see where they may have erred in ways that they shouldn't have as Christians, or because they weren't Christians. Help us to learn from these things, and help these things then to help us examine our own lives in our own time in ways that are God-glorifying, in ways that we might avoid the errors of those who've gone before us, and glorify you in our lives and decisions. In your son we pray, amen. I pray it's been beneficial to you all at home. Pray we've been a blessing to you. Have a good evening.